Unexpected Inheritance, a Legacy of Resistance. The wind whipped through Atlanta's downtown corridor on a crisp October morning, carrying with it the weight of generations. Amara Jenkins stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her uncle's, now her, office, watching the city wake up, unaware that her world was about to change forever. It had been 3 weeks earlier when the first phone call came in. Amara Jenkins had been holed up in the law library at Harvard, surrounded by thick textbooks and sticky notes scribbled with case summaries. She was preparing for her constitutional law exam, the kind of test that could make or break her semester. The library's silence was her solace, a bubble of focus where the outside world rarely intruded. That is, until her phone buzzed, shattering the stillness. Glancing at the screen, she saw Uncle Marcus flash across it. Her uncle never called during the day. He knew how busy her schedule was. He preferred to send cryptic texts about life's wisdom, usually something about balance, perseverance, or finding joy in the little things. But this wasn't a text. It was a call. Curious and a little concerned, she stepped outside into the crisp Boston air and answered. "Uncle Marcus?" she said, tucking her free hand into her coat pocket. His voice was low, strained, nothing like the warm, jovial tone she was used to. "Amara," he said, his words quick and clipped, as though he were looking over his shoulder. "They're watching." Her stomach nodded. "Who's watching?" "What are you talking about?" There was a pause, the kind that stretches too long, fraying nerves. "The Jenkins legacy," he finally said. "It's bigger than we ever told you." "Legacy?" Amara's voice rose with confusion. "Uncle Marcus, you're not making sense. What do you mean? Who's watching?" But Marcus didn't answer her questions. "Stay sharp," he said urgently, "and don't trust anyone. Not yet." The line went dead. Amara stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. Her uncle had always been a steady figure in her life, practical, deliberate, and composed. He wasn't one to indulge in paranoia or drama, which made his cryptic warning all the more unsettling. She tried calling him back, but it went straight to voicemail. The next 24 hours passed in a haze of confusion and unease. She texted her uncle, left voicemail after voicemail, and even called her mother to ask if Marcus was okay. Her mom had brushed it off, saying, "You know Marcus. He's probably caught up in one of his conspiracy theories. Don't let him distract you." But Amara couldn't let it go. Later, a second phone call came in. The call came late the following evening, just as Amara was preparing to head to bed. Her mother's voice was shaking on the other end. "Amara," her mom began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It's Marcus. He's gone." "Gone?" Amara repeated, her mind struggling to process the word. "What do you mean, gone?" "Heart failure," her mother said, the disbelief in her voice mirroring Amara's own. "He collapsed at work this afternoon. They couldn't save him." Heart failure. The phrase hung in the air like a bad punchline. Amara sank onto her bed, her heart pounding. Her uncle was 52 years old, a marathon runner, a health enthusiast who made green smoothies look appetizing. Heart failure didn't fit. It didn't make sense. But the world didn't stop to make sense for Amara. The next day brought an official obituary and a flood of condolences. Friends and family spoke of Marcus as a man of integrity, a mentor, a role model. They mourned his passing as a tragic and sudden loss. But Amara couldn't shake the nagging suspicion in her gut. The phone call, the warning. They're watching. What had he meant? She returned to Boston after the funeral, unable to shake the feeling that her uncle's death wasn't what it seemed. The police had closed the case, citing natural causes, but Amara couldn't let it go. Her uncle's final words looped in her mind like a haunting melody, their urgency growing louder with each passing day. 2 weeks later, the first package arrived. It was a plain manila envelope, delivered to her dorm with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The Jenkins Foundation. Dig deeper. Trust no one. Her breath caught as she read the words. The Jenkins Foundation was her family's legacy, a charitable organization founded by her great-grandfather to support underprivileged communities. It was well respected, a beacon of hope in her hometown. But the message was clear. There was more to the story. From that moment on, Amara's world began to unravel. A second package arrived the next day, this time containing old photographs of her great-grandfather standing beside men she didn't recognize. Men with powerful faces and dark, calculating eyes. Scribbled on the back of one photo were the words, "The Board of Six, Hidden Hands." Amara began researching obsessively, combing through every record and archive she could find about the Jenkins Foundation. She found glowing reports about its success, but very little about its early years. Every time she tried to access older records, she hit a wall. Missing files, restricted documents, and dead ends. And then, late one night, as she scoured the internet for clues, her screen suddenly went black. A message appeared in bold red letters. "Stop digging, Amara. You don't know what you're dealing with." Her blood ran cold. Someone had hacked her computer. Amara slammed her laptop shut, her pulse racing. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the picture they formed wasn't clear. Yet, someone, or some group, didn't want her uncovering the truth about her family's legacy. But what truth? What could be so dangerous about the Jenkins Foundation? Amara didn't know where this road would lead, but she knew one thing. Her uncle hadn't died of heart failure. He had died protecting a secret. And whatever that secret was, it was now her responsibility to uncover it. The shadows around her were growing darker, but Amara wasn't one to back down. Not now, not ever. She straightened her shoulders, her jaw tightening. If they thought she'd scare easily, they didn't know the first thing about her. Chapter 1. Inheritance of Secrets. The Jenkins Foundation wasn't just another nonprofit, it was a legacy. Founded in 1952 by her great-grandfather, Jameson Jenkins, during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, it had been a lifeline for Black communities across the southeastern United States. When systemic barriers kept families from owning homes, the foundation provided loans. When talented students were denied access to higher education, it awarded scholarships. When Black-owned businesses struggled to survive, it offered grants and mentorship programs. It was more than an organization. It was a beacon of hope, a force for change in a world determined to ignore the needs of marginalized people. Amara had grown up hearing stories about the Jenkins Foundation, how it had lifted communities, empowered leaders, and stood firm against systemic racism. She was proud of it, even if she had never been directly involved. But now, the weight of that legacy sat heavily on her shoulders. The wills reading took place in a small, wood-paneled conference room at a law office in downtown Atlanta. The air smelled faintly of leather and old books, and sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished table. Amara sat stiffly, hands clasped in her lap, while the lawyer droned on about property, trust funds, and formalities. Her grandmother, Eleanor Jenkins, sat at the head of the table, her presence commanding even in her old age. a living legend of the civil rights movement. Eleanor had spent her life fighting for justice and equality. Her sharp wit and piercing gaze had earned her respect from presidents and protesters alike. Amara couldn't help but feel small in her grandmother's presence. Eleanor had always been larger than life, a force of nature whose wisdom and stories carried the weight of history. Yet today, there was a quiet tension in her grandmother's demeanor, a kind of stillness that made Amara uneasy. The lawyer cleared his throat, drawing Amara's attention back to the table. "Lastly," he said, reaching for a sealed envelope with her name on it. "This was left for you, Miss Jenkins, by Marcus Jenkins prior to his passing." Amara's heart skipped a beat. She accepted the envelope with trembling hands, her uncle's cryptic phone call flashing in her mind. The Jenkins legacy, it's bigger than we ever told you. Inside, she found a handwritten note and a small encrypted hard drive. The note was brief but chilling. "The truth will set us free, but first it might destroy everything we've built." Her breath caught. What truth? And why had her uncle left it for her, of all people? Amara looked up from the note to find Eleanor watching her carefully. Her grandmother's expression was calm, but her sharp eyes betrayed a deeper concern. "Some battles," Eleanor said, her voice steady and low, "are won generations before the first shot is fired." Amara frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Eleanor replied, leaning forward, "that you're not the first Jenkins to be handed more questions than answers. Our family's legacy didn't come without cost. There are things I hoped you'd never have to face, Amara, but it seems Marcus believed otherwise." The air in the room seemed to thicken, the weight of Eleanor's words pressing down on Amara like a lead blanket. "Face what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood, her movements slow but deliberate, and placed a hand on Amara's shoulder. "The Jenkins Foundation has always been about building a better world," she said. "But the path to change isn't always clean. Sometimes the truth gets buried to protect the future. Marcus knew that. And now, so will you." Later that night, Amara sat in her apartment, the hard drive resting on the desk in front of her. She'd barely touched her dinner, her appetite swallowed by a growing sense of unease. What secrets could be so dangerous they might destroy everything the Foundation had built? She plugged the hard drive into her laptop. A password prompt appeared on the screen. She tried the obvious first: Marcus's birthday, the Foundation's anniversary, the street name of their childhood home. Nothing worked. Frustrated, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. Her uncle's note replayed in her mind. "The truth will set us free, but first, it might destroy everything we've built." The phrase felt familiar, like something she'd heard before. She rummaged through her memories, trying to place it. Then it clicked. Her great-grandfather's memoir. It had been published decades ago, a collection of essays and reflections on his life and work. She grabbed her phone and searched online for a copy of the book. The title stared back at her, "Truth to Build On." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed "Truth to Build On" into the password field and hit enter. The screen blinked, and the files on the hard drive appeared. What she saw made her stomach turn. There were hundreds of documents, emails, and financial records detailing the Foundation's history. At first glance, it looked like a collection of the organization's achievements: scholarships awarded, protests funded, programs launched. But as she dug deeper, she found something darker. There were references to private meetings with unnamed donors, substantial financial contributions from anonymous sources, and cryptic notes about political favors exchanged in the name of progress. One file stood out, Operation Keystone. Amara clicked on it. Her heart pounded as she skimmed the contents. It was a detailed plan, dated 1968, outlining a partnership between the Jenkins Foundation and several powerful corporate entities. The plan involved using the foundation's public goodwill to shield questionable business dealings, all in exchange for funding that had kept the foundation afloat for decades. She sat back, her mind reeling. Her great-grandfather had always been hailed as a hero, a man of unshakable integrity. But this was something else entirely. Had he made a devil's bargain to secure the foundation's survival? Amara's hands shook as she closed the file. She thought of Eleanor's words. Sometimes the truth gets buried to protect the future. By the time she went to bed, Amara's thoughts were a tangled web of doubt and determination. She didn't know how deep the secrets went or what they might cost her to uncover. But one thing was clear. The Jenkins legacy wasn't just a beacon of hope. It was a labyrinth of shadows. And somehow, she had to find her way through. Chapter 2: The Thin Veil of Power. Senator Robert Caldwell was more than a politician. He was an institution. Born into a family that had wielded influence in Atlanta for generations, Caldwell carried the aura of old Southern charm combined with modern political savvy. To the public, he was a progressive champion of economic reform and racial equity. He gave stirring speeches about justice, posed for pictures with church leaders, and donated generously to minority-owned businesses. But beneath the polished facade lay a far darker truth, one that Amara Jenkins was about to stumble upon. The discovery began innocently enough, or at least as innocent as uncovering encrypted files implicating powerful people could be. Sitting at her desk in her dimly lit apartment, Amara worked her way through the files on the hard drive her Uncle Marcus had left her. The more she uncovered, the more it became clear that the Jenkins Foundation's spotless reputation had long been used as a shield for hidden agendas. But the file that stopped her cold was labeled simply Caldwell 01. Curiosity mixed with dread as Amara clicked it open. Inside, she found a web of documents, spreadsheets, and scanned letters, all meticulously organized. As she began to piece it together, a chilling picture emerged. Senator Robert Caldwell, the so-called ally of Atlanta's black communities, had spent decades undermining the very progress he claimed to champion. The first document was a scanned memo from the early 2000s, detailing a backroom meeting between Caldwell, influential real estate developers, and city council members. The memo outlined a deal to reroute city funding originally designated for black-owned businesses into gentrification projects in historically black neighborhoods. Amara's stomach churned as she read further. The memo used vague, coded language, but the intent was clear: to replace black-owned shops and cultural landmarks with luxury apartments and boutique stores. Caldwell's name appeared again and again, always in connection with the word facilitator. The next file contained financial records, campaign donations from shell companies tied to wealthy developers, all funneled through Caldwell's political machine. The funds had been used to secure votes, push zoning changes, and quietly dismantle economic development programs that had once been the backbone of Atlanta's black middle class. Amara leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Caldwell wasn't just complicit in these schemes, he was the architect. If the financial records were damning, the voter suppression files were incendiary. One folder was titled Voter Integrity Operations, a euphemism that barely concealed its true purpose. Inside were emails between Caldwell and a political consultant detailing plans to systematically disenfranchise Black voters. They included polling place closures, concentrated in predominantly Black neighborhoods, forcing residents to travel miles to vote, voter ID laws, quietly pushed through the state legislature with Caldwell's backing, knowing they would disproportionately affect Black voters. Purge lists, lists of registered voters flagged for removal under the guise of maintenance, with a clear pattern targeting minority communities. Amara's hands trembled as she read. She thought about the countless people who had marched, protested, and fought for the right to vote. People like her grandmother Eleanor. And here was a man who had built his career on exploiting the very communities he claimed to support. But it was the final folder that took Amara's breath away. It was titled, The Jenkins Accord. Inside were records of a secret agreement between Senator Caldwell and the Jenkins Foundation, dated nearly 30 years ago. Amara's great-grandfather, Jameson Jenkins, had been in failing health at the time, and the foundation was struggling financially. According to the documents, Caldwell had offered a lifeline, a significant financial contribution to keep the foundation afloat. In return, the foundation would publicly endorse Caldwell's initiatives and remain silent on policies that harmed Black communities. Amara's pulse quickened. Her family's legacy, the foundation she had always believed was a force for good, had been complicit in Caldwell's schemes. Her great-grandfather, a man she had idolized, had made a deal with the devil to save the foundation. The file ended with a scanned letter, handwritten by Jameson Jenkins himself. Robert, this agreement weighs heavy on my conscience, but if it ensures the foundation's survival, I will bear the burden. My only hope is that future generations will have the courage to right these wrongs. Amara stared at the letter, her emotions swirling, anger, betrayal, grief. Her great-grandfather had been a hero, but he was also human. He had made choices in desperate times, and those choices had ripple effects that were still felt today. Amara sat in the silence of her apartment, the enormity of what she had uncovered pressing down on her like a physical weight. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a bombshell that could shatter the trust of an entire community. Caldwell's betrayal wasn't just about money or power. It was about erasing progress, stealing hope, and rewriting history to suit his agenda. Her mind raced with questions. What was she supposed to do with this information? Who could she trust? If she went public, Caldwell would come after her with everything he had. And what about the Jenkins Foundation? Revealing its complicity would destroy its reputation, but staying silent would make her complicit too. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from her grandmother. Sometimes the truth doesn't just set us free. It forces us to fight. Come home tomorrow. We need to talk. That night, Amara barely slept. Her mind was a battlefield, torn between fear and determination. She knew this wasn't just her fight. It was about the countless lives affected by Caldwell's schemes, the communities that had been silenced, and the legacy her family had both built and tarnished. As dawn broke, she packed her laptop and the hard drive into her bag. She didn't know exactly what her next move would be, but she knew one thing for certain: the truth couldn't stay buried. What Amara didn't know was that someone else was watching, someone who would stop at nothing to ensure the secret stayed hidden. And the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous her journey would become. Final chapter: Turning the Tide. Amara Jenkins had reached her breaking point, but she wasn't about to let fear or doubt paralyze her. The weight of the secrets she'd uncovered, Senator Caldwell's betrayal, her great-grandfather's desperate decisions, the Foundation's complicity, might have crushed anyone else. But Amara wasn't just anyone. She wasn't going to be a victim. She was going to be a weapon. Sitting in her grandmother Eleanor's study, surrounded by books on civil rights history and decades of collected wisdom, Amara felt the first flicker of resolve. Her grandmother had taught her that every battle for justice required more than passion. It required strategy. And if there was one thing Amara knew how to do, it was plan. "We don't just need to fight back," she told Eleanor, her voice steady. "We need to be smart. We need to build a case so strong they can't dismiss it. We're going to expose Caldwell and everyone who's been complicit." Eleanor studied her granddaughter, pride shining through her lined face. "Good," she said with a nod, "because if you're going to take on a man like Caldwell, you'll need more than facts. You'll need allies." Amara knew she couldn't do this alone. The stakes were too high, and her enemy was too powerful. But she also knew she had tools Caldwell couldn't anticipate: her Harvard law training, the Foundation's vast network, and a deep understanding of how to navigate systems of power. What she didn't have was time. Amara spent the next week assembling a team. She reached out to investigative journalists, people who weren't afraid to dig deep and challenge the status quo. She contacted community leaders who had spent years fighting for their neighborhoods and knew the impact of Caldwell's policies firsthand. And she enlisted legal experts, some her professors, others colleagues she had interned with, who understood the stakes and shared her desire for justice. Her grandmother, as always, proved to be an invaluable resource. Eleanor's network included veterans of the civil rights movement, people who had stood on the front lines of history. These were men and women who had marched on Selma, organized boycotts, and negotiated with politicians when the odds were stacked against them. "Don't underestimate their value," Eleanor told her. "They've seen how power operates, and they know how to dismantle it. They also know that true power isn't about destroying your enemy. It's about exposing the truth." Amara soon realized that her grandmother's connections weren't just helpful, they were essential. They brought a depth of knowledge and experience that balanced her legal expertise and youthful determination. As Amara's team began their work, the web of corruption grew clearer and darker. The investigative journalists uncovered a trail of financial transactions that confirmed Caldwell had funneled millions of dollars into shadowy accounts tied to real estate developers and political consultants. They found records of deals signed in secrecy, often at the expense of Black communities, and even discovered evidence of voter suppression tactics stretching back decades. The community leaders provided first-hand stories of the devastation Caldwell's policies had caused. They spoke of families forced out of their homes, businesses shuttered, and schools closed. Their testimonies gave the case an emotional weight that no document could replicate. The legal experts, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to ensure that every piece of evidence Amara had collected could stand up in court. They knew Caldwell's team would try to discredit anything they presented, so their case had to be airtight. As the weeks passed, Amara's team grew stronger and more determined, but so did the resistance they faced. It didn't take long for Caldwell to realize that someone was working against him. His connections in law enforcement and the media tipped him off to the growing movement, and he wasted no time in responding. First, there were the smear campaigns. Amara's name appeared in headlines, accusing her of being a radical agitator trying to destabilize the city. Social media was flooded with bots spreading lies about her personal life, twisting her Harvard education into a symbol of elitism rather than empowerment. Then came the threats. late-night phone calls, anonymous emails, a car that seemed to be parked outside her apartment for hours at a time. "You sure you want to keep this up?" Tasha asked one night as she sat with Amara, scrolling through hateful comments on a fake news article about her. "These people don't play fair." "I know," Amara replied, her voice firm. "But if I back down now, nothing changes. Caldwell wins and they keep destroying our communities. I can't let that happen." Her resolve only deepened when she received a message from one of the journalists on her team. Caldwell had hired a private investigator to dig into her family's past, hoping to find dirt he could use against her. But Amara was ready. The turning point came when Amara's team uncovered a critical piece of evidence: a recorded conversation between Caldwell and one of his top donors. In the recording, Caldwell boasted about manipulating city funding to favor developers who lined his campaign coffers.
"People don't care about the details,"
Caldwell said in the recording.
"They care about the speeches, the headlines. As long as we give them a good show, they'll buy whatever we're selling."
The arrogance in his voice was infuriating and damning. Amara knew this recording was the key to bringing Caldwell down, but releasing it would put everything and everyone in danger. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. True power isn't about destroying your enemy, but about exposing the truth. Amara decided the time had come to go public. She organized a rally in the heart of Eastlake, the community most affected by Caldwell's corruption. The event drew hundreds of people: families, business owners, activists, and media outlets hungry for a story. Standing on a makeshift stage, Amara looked out at the crowd. For a moment, she felt the weight of the moment, the fear of what might happen next. But then she thought of her Uncle Marcus, her grandmother, and all the people who had fought for justice before her. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "Senator Robert Caldwell has spent his career pretending to be an ally," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But the truth is, he's been working against us all along. Tonight, I'm going to show you what he doesn't want you to see." She played the recording, the crowd falling silent as Caldwell's voice filled the air. By the time it ended, the silence gave way to shouts of anger, disbelief, and determination. "This isn't just about Caldwell," Amara continued. "This is about the system that allowed him to thrive. It's about fighting for our communities, our families, and our future. And we're not going to stop until justice is served." The fallout was immediate. The recording went viral, sparking investigations into Caldwell's finances, policies, and connections. The media turned on him, and even his most loyal allies began to distance themselves. But for Amara, this wasn't just a victory. It was a beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but she had proven that the truth, when wielded with courage and integrity, could be a powerful weapon. As her grandmother had said, some battles are won generations before the first shot is fired. Amara's fight was just another chapter in the Jenkins family legacy, a legacy of resilience, justice, and unwavering faith. Just as Amara felt she was gaining ground, unraveling the threads of corruption tied to Senator Caldwell, a shocking discovery threatened to upend everything she thought she knew about her family and herself. It happened late one night in Eleanor's study. Amara had been poring over old family records her grandmother had reluctantly agreed to share. Stacks of faded documents, letters, and photographs were spread across the large oak desk, the remnants of a history carefully curated and passed down through generations. Among the records was a yellowed photograph of her great-grandfather, Jameson Jenkins, shaking hands with a white man in front of what appeared to be a newly opened community center. "What's this?" Amara asked, holding up the photo. "Eleanor," sitting nearby in her armchair, glanced over and stiffened. "That," she said slowly, "is Henry Caldwell, Senator Caldwell's grandfather." Amara froze. Caldwell's grandfather? What does he have to do with the Jenkins Foundation? Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's complicated," she said, her tone signaling she was about to reveal something deeply buried. Eleanor began to recount a history that Amara had never heard before, a story woven with both triumph and pain. Henry Caldwell had been a white landowner in Georgia during the Jim Crow era, a man who played both sides of the racial divide. Publicly, he upheld segregation and exploited black labor, using his wealth and influence to maintain the status quo. But privately, he had quietly funneled resources to black community leaders, including Jamison Jenkins, to fund schools, clinics, and other essential services that the government refused to provide. "Why would he do that?" Amara asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Guilt, maybe. Ambition, definitely," Eleanor replied. Men like him wanted to control everything, even their own charity. He helped, but only on his terms. And there was something else. Henry had a son, a biracial son. Amara's breath caught. "Yes," Eleanor continued, her eyes locking with Amara's. "That boy was raised by his mother, a young woman who worked on Henry's estate. He was never publicly acknowledged, but Henry made sure he was educated and provided for. That boy grew up to be part of our family." The weight of the revelation settled heavily in the room. "You mean..." Amara's voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Senator Caldwell is distant kin," Eleanor said plainly. "And whether he knows it or not, he's been tied to our family's history for generations." This wasn't just a political battle anymore. It was a deeply personal reckoning with a past shaped by exploitation, survival, and the tangled complexities of Southern society. For Amara, the revelation was both a shock and a call to action. "It makes sense now," she said, pacing the room. "Why he always had a hand in our communities, but never in the right way. He's been trying to rewrite a legacy that's haunted him, using power to erase the shame of where he came from." Eleanor nodded solemnly. "But power built on lies doesn't last. It's time for him to face the truth." Amara knew that exposing Caldwell's corruption wasn't just about justice for the present. It was about healing wounds that had festered for decades. The federal hearing was held in a packed courthouse in downtown Atlanta. It had become a media sensation, with reporters crowding the steps and activists holding signs demanding accountability. Inside, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Amara, dressed in a sharp navy suit, sat at the witness table, her face calm but her heart pounding. Across the room sat Senator Caldwell, flanked by his legal team, his expression one of forced composure. When her name was called, Amara rose and took her place at the stand. She had spent weeks preparing, but the weight of the moment still pressed on her. This wasn't just about Caldwell. It was about exposing a system that had thrived on deceit and exploitation for generations. She began with the facts, presenting financial records and communication logs that painted a damning picture of Caldwell's corruption. She described the voter suppression tactics, the backroom deals, and the systematic dismantling of programs meant to uplift marginalized communities. But then, she pivoted. "This isn't just a story of greed or political ambition," she said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "This is a story of legacy, of how the choices made generations ago ripple into the present. Senator Caldwell's actions didn't start with him. They're part of a history we've all inherited, one built on both courage and complicity. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. As the hearing continued, the evidence mounted against Caldwell. Community leaders testified about the harm his policies had caused. Journalists presented exposés detailing his financial schemes. By the end of the proceedings, Caldwell's once loyal allies were scrambling to distance themselves from him. The final blow came when the federal investigators announced additional charges: fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Caldwell's carefully constructed facade crumbled before the eyes of the nation. For Amara, the victory was bittersweet. Caldwell's fall was necessary, but it came with the acknowledgement of her own family's role in the tangled web of history. In the aftermath of the hearing, the Jenkins Foundation faced intense scrutiny. But instead of collapsing under the weight of its complicated past, it emerged stronger. Federal investigations into Caldwell's misappropriation of funds led to significant settlements, much of which was funneled into the foundation. Amara worked tirelessly with her grandmother and the foundation's board to ensure the money was used to rebuild and expand programs for Black communities across the Southeast. Scholarships were doubled, housing initiatives were launched, and new partnerships were formed with organizations dedicated to equity and justice. For the first time in decades, the foundation wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Standing on the steps of the courthouse after the hearing, Amara looked out at the crowd that had gathered. She thought of her uncle Marcus, her great-grandfather Jameson, and all the people who had fought for a better world. "This isn't the end," she said quietly to her grandmother. Eleanor smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "No, baby, it's a beginning." As Amara walked down the steps, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. The Jenkins legacy had been tarnished, but it had also been redeemed, and now it was her turn to carry it forward. Epilogue. A legacy continued. The courthouse steps were nearly empty now, the crowd of reporters, supporters, and onlookers having dispersed as the day's events came to a close. The air was quiet, heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Amara Jenkins sat on a bench just outside the old building, the city lights casting a warm glow around her. Her mind swirled with thoughts of the battle she had fought and won, but also of the scars it had left behind. Her grandmother, Eleanor Jenkins, walked toward her, her steps measured but strong. She carried the air of someone who had seen history repeat itself too many times, but who still held on to hope for the next generation. Sitting down beside her granddaughter, Eleanor reached out and gently placed a hand on Amara's knee. "You did it," Eleanor said, her voice soft but firm. Amara let out a shaky breath, a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Did I?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "I mean, we stopped Caldwell, but at what cost? The Jenkins Foundation barely survived, and now everyone knows about everything." Eleanor smiled, her expression both tender and knowing. "Baby, the truth doesn't destroy. It rebuilds. What you've done is more than just win a battle. You've set the foundation free from the lies that bound it. Now it can truly serve the people it was meant to serve." Amara turned to look at her grandmother, her chest tightening. "But what about what people think of us, of our family? What about the compromises great-grandfather made?" Eleanor's eyes softened, her wisdom shining through. Jameson Jenkins was a man of his time. He made choices that were hard, choices that might seem wrong now but came from a place of survival. He did what he thought he had to do to keep the foundation alive. And because of his sacrifices, you were able to do what he couldn't, tell the truth. That's how legacies grow. They're not about perfection, Amara. They're about progress. Prepared for a purpose. Eleanor shifted on the bench, her gaze distant for a moment, as if recalling a memory from long ago. Then she looked back at Amara, her expression serious but warm. "You remind me of someone," she said. "Who?" Amara asked, her curiosity piqued. "Esther," Eleanor replied simply, her voice softening with reverence. "Just like Esther, you were prepared for such a time as this." Amara frowned slightly, the story of Esther drifting into her mind from Sunday school lessons long past. "Esther was a queen," she said. "I'm just me." Eleanor chuckled, shaking her head. "Esther wasn't always a queen, baby. She was an ordinary woman, plucked out of obscurity and placed in a position she never asked for. But when her people needed her, she didn't back down. She found her courage, stood before the king, and used her voice to save lives. Just like you did." Amara swallowed hard, the weight of her grandmother's words settling over her. "You didn't choose this fight," Eleanor continued, "but you stepped into it because you knew it was right. You used what God gave you, your mind, your education, your heart, to stand up for your people, even when it was dangerous. That's what Esther did, and just like her, you didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for generations to come." As the two women sat in silence, the city hummed around them. Cars passed, faint music drifted from a nearby restaurant, and the cool night air carried the scent of rain. "I guess the real work starts now," Amara said finally, breaking the quiet. Eleanor nodded. "It always does, but you've got the strength for it, and you're not alone." Amara smiled faintly, the words comforting her. She thought of the team she had built, the journalists, community leaders, and legal experts who had stood by her side. She thought of the people who had rallied behind the foundation, the families who would now benefit from its renewed mission. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. In the weeks that followed, the Jenkins Foundation entered a new chapter. Under Amara's leadership, it expanded its reach, launching initiatives that directly addressed the damage caused by Caldwell's policies. Affordable housing projects sprang up in East Lake Heights. A new scholarship fund was established, specifically for students from underserved communities. Amara made it her mission to ensure that the foundation's future would be built on transparency and integrity. She knew the weight of the past would never fully disappear, but she also knew it didn't define them. The foundation became a beacon once more, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. On the anniversary of her victory, Amara returned to the courthouse steps where it had all culminated. Standing there, she felt the presence of her great-grandfather, her Uncle Marcus, and all the others who had come before her. Their sacrifices and struggles had paved the way for her to stand tall in this moment. As she looked out over the city, she felt a sense of clarity. Esther didn't start as a queen, she whispered to herself, echoing her grandmother's words, but she ended as one. And so would she. With her grandmother's blessing, her community's trust, and her own unshakable determination, Amara Jenkins stepped into her future, not as someone burdened by a legacy, but as someone determined to redefine it. Reflection: modern echoes of an ancient story. The parallels with the biblical Esther run deep. Both stories are about unexpected heroes who emerge at critical moments to save their communities. Just as Esther was placed in the palace for such a time as this, Esther 4:14, Amara was placed in her own modern-day fight. In the biblical narrative, Esther, a Jewish woman in the Persian court, risked her life by approaching the king uninvited to save her people from genocide. She used her unique position, her intelligence, and her courage to transform a potentially devastating situation. Amara's journey mirrors this precisely. Like Esther, she was placed in a position of potential influence unexpectedly, discovered a plot against her community. She used strategic intelligence rather than just raw power. She risked her personal safety and career to expose the truth. She transformed a potentially destructive situation into an opportunity for community healing and progress. But there's a deeper theological theme. Both stories speak to the concept of divine positioning, the belief that individuals are sometimes placed in specific moments of history, not by accident, but by design. The biblical text suggests that Esther's famous declaration, "If I perish, I perish," was rooted in a deeper understanding that her life had a purpose beyond her personal comfort or safety. Similarly, Amara's journey was about something far larger than personal ambition. Both narratives challenge the powerful through seemingly powerless individuals. They demonstrate that true leadership isn't about position or privilege, but about moral courage and a commitment to justice. In both the biblical story and Amara's modern tale, redemption comes not through violence, but through strategic truth-telling, not through destroying enemies, but by exposing systemic injustice. Through Amara, we are reminded that the battles we fight today are often rooted in the sacrifices of those who came before us, and the victories we achieve pave the way for those who will come after. The ultimate message remains consistent across millennia. When individuals are willing to stand up, speak truth, and risk everything for their community, transformation is possible. True legacies are not defined by perfection. They are defined by the willingness to face the truth and fight for justice, no matter the cost. Amara Jenkins' story is a powerful tale of resilience, truth, and legacy. Now, we want to hear from you. What moments in this journey stood out to you the most? How do you feel Amara's fight for justice reflects the struggles many communities face today? Do you see parallels to historical or biblical figures like Esther, or perhaps modern-day challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights could spark meaningful conversations. And stay tuned for more amazing stories.